We have reports from Paris that Diana, Princess of Wales, has been killed in a car accident and that her partner, Dodi Fayed, has also been killed.
Princess Diana's last 24 hours were filled with tension, emotions, and a relentless media pursuit. But what really happened in those final moments before tragedy struck? To understand how the day unfolded, we must go back to the morning of August 30, 1997, when Diana was still in the heart of Paris, unaware that this would be the last full day of her life. She had been staying at the Ritz Paris, one of the most luxurious hotels in the city. The hotel was owned by Mohammed Al Fayed, the father of Dodi Fayed, the man Diana had been romantically linked to that summer. Their relationship had been under intense scrutiny, with the paparazzi capturing their every move for weeks. By this point, Diana was no stranger to media attention, but the level of intrusion had escalated to an almost unbearable degree. That morning, Diana and Dodi left the Ritz for a private visit to Villa Windsor, a historic mansion that once belonged to the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. The property held deep significance in British history, as it was the home of Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, after Edward abdicated the British throne in 1936. Mohammed Al Fayed had purchased the villa and was in the process of restoring it, a project he had hoped Diana would take interest in. The visit was supposed to be a quiet, intimate moment, but even here, away from the bustling streets of Paris, the paparazzi were never too far behind. As they walked around the grounds, it was clear that Diana was in a reflective mood. She had always been drawn to stories of outsiders within the royal family, and Edward VIII's love affair with Wallis Simpson had long fascinated her. Some later speculated that she saw a connection between her own life and that of Wallis, a woman who had been vilified by the British establishment for loving a man who chose her over the crown. Whether or not Diana saw a parallel between their stories, one thing was certain: she was looking ahead to a future outside of the constraints of royal life. By the time she and Dodi returned to the Ritz in the afternoon, the media presence had intensified. Photographers were stationed outside the hotel, waiting for any glimpse of her. They had been tracking her movements throughout the summer, with an almost predatory determination. The frenzy had only grown after photos of Diana and Dodi vacationing on a yacht in the Mediterranean had surfaced in newspapers worldwide. The images, which showed them embracing on the deck, had fueled speculation that Dodi was preparing to propose. Some sources later claimed that a ring had been purchased from a jeweler in Monte Carlo, but no evidence has ever confirmed that Diana was aware of or interested in an engagement. Her longtime butler and close confidant Paul Burrell later dismissed these engagement rumors, stating that Diana had shared her future plans with him, and marriage to Dodi was not one of them. According to Burrell, she had other aspirations. Diana had recently spoken about her growing interest in humanitarian work, particularly focusing on banning landmines and advocating for children's welfare. A proposal from Dodi would have complicated her already intricate personal life. Friends later claimed that while Diana enjoyed his company, she was not looking for a serious commitment. Despite this, the speculation persisted. Diana's love life had always been a subject of fascination for the press, and her relationship with Dodi was no exception. Ever since her divorce from Prince Charles had been finalized in August 1996, the media had been eager to see what direction her life would take. She was no longer bound by royal expectations, but she was still the most famous woman in the world, and her every move was scrutinized. Even as she tried to focus on her charitable efforts, the tabloids seemed more interested in her personal affairs. As the afternoon wore on, Diana took a moment to reach out to the two people who meant the most to her sons, Prince William and Prince Harry. At around 5 p.m., she made what would be her final phone call to them. The young princes were spending their summer break at Balmoral Castle in Scotland with their father, Prince Charles. The call was short and casual, nothing out of the ordinary. Diana asked how they were doing, and the boys, eager to get back to playing, kept the conversation brief. At the time, they had no idea that this would be the last time they would hear their mother's voice. Later, both William and Harry would speak about this call with deep regret. In interviews years after Diana's death, they recalled wishing they had spoken to her longer. Harry, in particular, later said that if he had known it was his last chance, he would never have rushed off the phone so quickly. But at the time, it was just another conversation, another check-in from their loving mother. Diana, on the other hand, had no way of knowing that in just a few short hours, she would be caught in a sequence of events that would lead to one of the most shocking tragedies of the 20th century. For Diana, the day had been relatively calm on the surface. She had spent time with Dodi, visited a historic villa, and checked in with her sons. But beneath the surface, the pressure of constant media attention was ever present. Even inside the Ritz, the weight of the world seemed to follow her. By evening, decisions would be made that would alter the course of history. As the sun set over Paris, Diana had no idea that she was about to enter the final hours of her life. What began as a routine day would soon spiral into a chaotic night, one that would set the stage for a tragic series of events. The early evening hours inside the Ritz Paris carried an air of tension, one that had become all too familiar to Diana in the weeks leading up to that night. The flashes of cameras never seemed to stop, and the anticipation outside the hotel only grew as the hours passed. What should have been a quiet evening in Paris had turned into a logistical nightmare. Diana and Dodi had initially planned to dine at Chez Benoit, a well-known Parisian restaurant, but by 6 p.m., the streets outside were swarming with photographers. Any attempt to go there would have been impossible without causing a scene. The attention was suffocating, forcing them to change plans at the last minute. Instead of going out, they decided to stay within the safety of the Ritz. A private dinner was arranged in the Imperial Suite, an opulent space reserved for elite guests seeking privacy. Inside, away from the chaos outside, the couple was finally able to relax. Ritz staff later recalled that Diana appeared in good spirits despite the circumstances. She and Dodi spent the evening dining quietly, talking and trying to enjoy what remained of their time in Paris. They were aware of the photographers outside, but they had grown used to their presence. It was an unfortunate reality of Diana's life. There was no escaping the cameras. As the evening progressed, Ritz security staff began to discuss the growing issue outside. By 10 p.m., the crowd had grown significantly. More than 30 photographers were now stationed around the entrance of the hotel, determined to get a glimpse of Diana and Dodi when they left. Some were on foot, others were waiting on motorcycles, engines revving in anticipation. The energy in the air was unsettling. It was not just about taking pictures, it was about the chase, the competition to get the most exclusive shot. The photographers knew that any image of Diana and Dodi together that night would be worth a fortune. Inside the hotel, a decision had to be made. Dodi was eager to leave the Ritz and return to his private apartment, located near the Arc de Triomphe. But the question remained, how could they get out without being swarmed by the media? Henri Paul, the acting head of security at the Ritz, was given the responsibility of coordinating an escape plan. His idea was simple but risky. A decoy vehicle would be sent out from the hotel's front entrance, drawing the attention of the waiting photographers, while Diana and Dodi would quietly slip out the back in another car. Henri Paul had been with the Ritz security team for years, and though he was not their usual driver, he was trusted within the hotel. What was unknown to Diana and Dodi, however, was that Henri had reportedly been drinking earlier that evening. Surveillance footage from inside the hotel bar showed him having drinks, though Ritz staff later insisted that he did not appear intoxicated. Those who interacted with him that night described him as confident and composed. Whatever the case, he was tasked with driving them out of the hotel unnoticed. By 11 p.m., the atmosphere outside had reached a fever pitch. The anticipation of Diana's departure had turned the scene into a spectacle. Reporters and photographers were on high alert, their lenses pointed at the entrance of the Ritz, ready to capture the moment the couple emerged. Hotel staff moved discreetly through the hallways, preparing for the planned exit. The decoy vehicle was positioned at the front of the hotel, while the black Mercedes-Benz S280, the car Diana and Dodi would take, was brought around to the rear entrance. As midnight approached, Diana and Dodi made their way downstairs. The Ritz security team had done their best to ensure the departure went unnoticed, but there was no way to be certain they would succeed. At 12:15 a.m., hotel surveillance cameras captured Diana and Dodi walking through the lobby for the last time. The footage, later released to the public, showed Diana wearing a sleek black blazer over a light-colored top, her expression composed but slightly tense. Dodie walked beside her, also appearing calm. At the front desk, Henry Paul stood waiting. In just minutes, they would step outside, leaving the safety of the Ritz behind. The moment they exited the rear entrance, the plan appeared to be working. The photographers stationed at the front of the hotel were still focused on the decoy car, allowing Diana and Dodie to slip into their waiting Mercedes without immediate disturbance. Henry Paul took the driver's seat, while Trevor Rees-Jones, Dodie's bodyguard, sat in the front passenger seat. Diana and Dodie settled into the back, expecting a smooth ride to their destination. But within seconds, the photographers realized what had happened. The decoy car had fooled some of them, but not all. A few had managed to spot the real vehicle leaving from the back, and within moments, the chase was on. Motorcycles and cars swerved through the streets, desperate to catch up with the black Mercedes as it sped away from the Ritz. What happened next was a reckless and chaotic attempt to evade the cameras, one that would prove disastrous. The Mercedes-Benz S280 slipped out of the Ritz Paris's rear entrance, its polished exterior reflecting the dim glow of the Parisian streetlights. Inside, Diana and Dodie Fayed sat in the back seat, their conversation hushed. Up front, bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones was alert, scanning the road ahead. Henry Paul, behind the wheel, kept his hands steady, aware that the success of their escape depended entirely on his ability to maneuver through the city unnoticed. For a few seconds, it seemed as though the plan had worked. The decoy car at the front entrance had drawn the attention of most of the waiting paparazzi, allowing the black Mercedes to pull away without immediate pursuit. The streets were eerily quiet as they rolled forward. Diana let out a breath, the tension in her shoulders loosening slightly. After a day of relentless media pressure, she had a moment of quiet. But it did not last long. From the side streets, headlights appeared in the distance. Some of the photographers had realized the ruse almost instantly and had doubled back, racing toward the real car. Within moments, motorcycles and compact cars swerved into the road, engines roaring. The chase had begun. Henry Paul pressed his foot down, and the Mercedes shot forward, weaving through the streets of Paris. The car sped past Place Vendôme, its tires gripping the pavement as it pushed toward Place de la Concorde. The intention had been to take a direct route to Dodie's apartment near the Arc de Triomphe, but the pursuit made that nearly impossible. The photographers were relentless, cutting across lanes and closing in on the car from multiple directions. The speedometer climbed, 60 miles per hour, 70, 80. Trevor Rees-Jones, seated in the front passenger seat, shifted uneasily. His job was to protect Diana and Dodie, but at that moment, he had little control over the situation. His seatbelt was fastened tightly across his chest, his body bracing against every sharp turn. In the back seat, Diana and Dodie held on as the car jolted from side to side. The lights of the city blurred past the windows. Behind them, the paparazzi were undeterred. Camera flashes flickered like lightning in the night, their reflections bouncing off the car's glossy surface. Some of the photographers leaned dangerously close, their motorcycles inches away from the vehicle. A few even tried to pull ahead, cutting off the Mercedes in an effort to force it to slow down. The car raced past the Seine, moving at an unsafe pace for the narrow roads of central Paris. Henry Paul gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. He had worked for the Ritz for years and was familiar with the city's roads, but he was operating under pressure he had never encountered before. The weight of the chase, the responsibility of carrying the most famous woman in the world in the back seat, and the intensity of the speeding motorcycles all bore down on him. The entrance to the Pont de l'Alma tunnel loomed ahead. A long, dark passage beneath the Seine, its wide interior had seen its fair share of reckless drivers over the years. Henry Paul made the split-second decision to enter. Perhaps for a brief moment, he thought they could lose their pursuers in the tunnel's darkness. It was 12:23 a.m. when the Mercedes hurtled inside. The roar of the engine echoed against the tunnel walls as the car sped forward. The vehicle, now traveling at nearly 85 miles per hour, was moving dangerously fast for the curve ahead. Henry Paul tugged at the wheel, attempting to correct the car's trajectory. The tires screeched against the pavement. Then, in an instant, it happened. The Mercedes swerved violently to the right, its front bumper clipping the curb. Henry Paul lost control, The car skidded across the lane before slamming, full force, into the 13th pillar of the tunnel. The sound of the crash was deafening, a metallic explosion that sent shockwaves through the tunnel. The impact crushed the front of the vehicle, sending shards of glass and twisted metal flying in every direction. The hood of the car crumpled like paper, absorbing the sheer force of the collision. The weight of the impact lifted the rear of the vehicle slightly off the ground before it slammed back down, rocking violently before coming to a final, shuddering stop. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the chaos resumed. The photographers, who had been trailing behind, arrived at the scene within seconds. Some leaped from their motorcycles, cameras already raised, their fingers pressing down on the shutters. Flashes illuminated the wreckage, revealing the horrific scene inside. Henri Paul was dead. His body lay motionless against the steering wheel, the force of the impact having taken his life instantly. Dodi Fayed had not survived either. He had been sitting on the right side of the back seat, the side of the vehicle that had taken the full brunt of the crash. The force had thrown him forward with unimaginable speed, killing him on impact. Trevor Rees-Jones, though severely injured, was still alive. His face was unrecognizable, his bones shattered, but his seatbelt had kept him inside the car. His body was mangled, but he was breathing. Diana, unbelievably, was also alive. She had been thrown forward by the crash but had not suffered an immediately fatal blow. Her body was twisted in the back seat, her head resting against what remained of the door. She was conscious, but in shock. A passerby, a doctor named Frederick Maillier, happened to be driving through the tunnel at the time. He pulled over, stepping toward the wreckage. His training told him that the situation was grave. He could see that the driver and the man in the back seat were already gone. Then he saw Diana. She was barely moving, her breathing shallow. As he approached, she mumbled something, her words barely audible. Later, some reports suggested she had whispered, "Oh my God, what's happened?" It was the only indication that she was still aware of her surroundings. Dr. Maillier did what he could with the supplies he had on hand. He retrieved an oxygen mask from his vehicle and placed it gently over Diana's face, trying to stabilize her until help arrived. He knew she needed immediate medical attention, but he had no idea who she was. It wasn't until the photographers swarmed around shouting her name that he realized the magnitude of the situation. The scene in the tunnel grew more chaotic by the second. Paramedics were already on their way, but the photographers were relentless, continuing to take pictures even as Diana lay helpless inside the car. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. In the wreckage of the tunnel, emergency responders arrived. But could they save Diana? The sound of sirens echoed through the Pont de l'Alma tunnel as emergency vehicles sped toward the wreckage. At 12:30 a.m., the first responders arrived, their flashing lights illuminating the mangled remains of the black Mercedes. The scene before them was devastating. The car had been crushed upon impact, its front end almost unrecognizable. Glass shards and twisted metal littered the tunnel floor, a grim testament to the sheer force of the collision. As paramedics approached the wreck, they quickly assessed the victims. Henri Paul, the driver, was clearly beyond saving, his body motionless against the steering wheel. Dodi Fayed, too, showed no signs of life, his injuries fatal on impact. But there was movement in the back seat. Diana was still alive. She was slumped over, her body twisted unnaturally, but her breathing was faint. As a paramedic leaned in, he heard her mumble something, her voice weak and disoriented. "Oh my God, what's happened?" Her words barely carried over the noise of the scene, but they were enough to confirm that she was conscious. Her eyelids fluttered, and her face was marked with shock, but she had survived the initial crash. Trevor Rees-Jones, the bodyguard, was also still alive, though barely. His injuries were catastrophic, his face shattered, yet his seatbelt had prevented him from being thrown forward like the others. He remained trapped, his body pinned by the crumpled dashboard. The paramedics knew they had to work quickly, but Diana's condition was complicated. Despite being conscious, she had sustained severe internal injuries, the extent of which was not immediately visible. Her pulse was weak, and her breathing was shallow. Instead of rushing her straight to the hospital, they made a crucial decision: to treat her on the scene first. This was standard protocol in France, where emergency responders prioritize stabilizing critically injured patients before transport. Diana was carefully removed from the wreckage, her body supported by medics as they laid her on the pavement beside the vehicle. An oxygen mask was placed over her face, and intravenous lines were inserted in an attempt to keep her blood pressure from dropping further. As they worked, the tunnel remained a chaotic scene. Paparazzi continued snapping photos, their flashes illuminating Diana's fragile form. Police officers shouted at them to step back, but some photographers refused to stop. The paramedics tried to focus, shielding their patient from the cameras as best they could. Minutes stretched on as the team fought to stabilize her. Diana's injuries were more severe than they had first realized. She had suffered massive internal bleeding, a torn pulmonary vein that was slowly robbing her of life. Her heart was struggling, her body weak from the trauma. At 1:50 a.m., after nearly an hour of treatment on the roadside, she was finally placed into an ambulance. The decision had been made to transport her to Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital, one of the most advanced medical centers in Paris. The journey was only a few miles, but with her condition deteriorating, every second counted. The ambulance moved carefully through the Paris streets, its sirens wailing. The paramedics monitored Diana closely, adjusting her oxygen supply and administering emergency treatment as they went. At one point, her blood pressure dropped dangerously low, forcing the team to stop and perform a resuscitation attempt. Time was slipping away. By the time they arrived at Pitié-Salpêtrière at 2:06 a.m., Diana's condition was critical. She was immediately wheeled into the hospital's trauma unit, where a team of top surgeons and specialists awaited her. They worked tirelessly, their focus singular, to save the life of the most famous woman in the world. The lead surgeon, Professor Bruno Rieu, assessed the extent of her injuries. A scan revealed the full scope of the damage. The crash had caused massive internal trauma, particularly to her chest. The most alarming injury was a severe tear in her pulmonary vein, one of the most crucial blood vessels connected to the heart. It was bleeding uncontrollably. Surgery was the only option. Diana was rushed into the operating room, where doctors performed an open-chest procedure in an attempt to stop the bleeding. The team worked with precision, desperately trying to repair the ruptured vein. For 2 hours, they fought to keep her alive. Despite their efforts, her heart had suffered too much damage. The blood loss was overwhelming and resuscitation attempts failed. At 4 a.m., Diana was pronounced dead. The room fell silent. The team of doctors, exhausted from the battle they had just fought, stood still for a moment, absorbing the enormity of what had happened. The life they had tried to save was one that had meant so much to so many. News of her death did not reach the public immediately. The hospital informed key officials first, including British Ambassador Michael Jay and French Interior Minister Jean-Pierre Chevènement. From there, the word was passed to the British government and the royal family. Prince Charles, still at Balmoral with his sons, was woken with the devastating news. Plans were immediately put into motion to bring Diana's body back to London. The world would soon wake up to the shocking news of Diana's tragic passing. At 6 a.m. on August 31, 1997, the BBC interrupted its regular programming with an announcement that sent shockwaves around the world. Princess Diana was dead. The news anchors, visibly shaken, relayed the devastating confirmation from Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital. Within minutes, headlines around the globe carried the same tragic message. The People's Princess, as she had come to be known, had succumbed to her injuries after a horrific car crash in Paris. In homes across Britain and beyond, disbelief turned to grief. People who had never met Diana personally felt the weight of her loss as if they had lost someone close to them. Tears flowed in living rooms and cafes, at breakfast tables and workplaces. In London, hundreds of people began gathering outside Kensington Palace, the home she had made her own after her separation from Prince Charles. Flowers, candles, and handwritten notes were placed at the gates, creating an ever-growing sea of tributes. Across the world, newspapers ran headlines that captured the enormity of the loss. "Diana dead," read the front page of the Sunday Times. "World mourns a princess," declared the New York Times. The French newspaper Le Monde described her as a woman of heart, while in Germany, Die Welt called her the Queen of People's Hearts. In every country, the sentiment was the same. This was not just the passing of a princess, but of a global icon. The British government scrambled to respond. Prime Minister Tony Blair, who had met Diana only weeks before, addressed the nation that morning. His voice was heavy with emotion as he described her as the people's princess, a phrase that would become forever linked with her memory. He spoke of her warmth, her compassion, and her unique ability to connect with people from all walks of life. His words echoed what millions were feeling. Diana had been more than a royal figure. She had been a symbol of kindness and change. At Balmoral Castle in Scotland, the royal family remained silent in the immediate aftermath. The Queen, Prince Philip, and Prince Charles were focused on comforting William and Harry, who had just lost their mother. The young princes, only 15 and 12 years old, had been woken early to be told the news. Their world had shattered in an instant. For them, Diana was not a global icon. She was simply Mum. By midday, the pressure on the royal family to respond publicly was mounting. The monarchy's initial silence was met with growing criticism, with some questioning why the Queen had not yet addressed the grieving nation. Meanwhile, Prince Charles had already made arrangements to travel to Paris to bring Diana's body home. At 3 p.m., Charles boarded a royal aircraft alongside Diana's two sisters, Lady Sarah McCorquodale and Lady Jane Fellows. The flight to France was somber, the reality of the situation sinking in with every passing moment. Upon arrival in Paris, Charles and Diana's sisters were escorted to Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital. There, in a private room, Diana's body lay in repose, her face peaceful in death. The room was quiet as Charles approached. Despite their complicated past, Diana had been the mother of his children, a woman he had once loved. He stood for a moment, looking at her, before bowing his head in respect. Her sisters standing beside him were overcome with grief. A short time later, her coffin was carefully placed into a waiting vehicle, draped in the royal standard. As the convoy made its way to the airport, thousands of Parisians lined the streets, standing in silence as a final tribute. Some held flowers, others wiped away tears. The outpouring of sorrow in France was profound. Many people felt a sense of guilt, believing the relentless paparazzi had played a role in the tragedy. By the time Diana's coffin arrived in London that evening, Kensington Palace had become a shrine. The floral tributes had grown into an overwhelming display of love, stretching for hundreds of feet along the palace gates. People stood in silence, some kneeling in prayer, others lighting candles. Strangers comforted one another, united in their grief. Over the next week, the mourning only intensified. Each day, more flowers were placed at the palace gates. Bouquets covered the ground so thickly that the scent of lilies, roses, and chrysanthemums filled the air. Messages of love and sorrow were tucked among them. "We will never forget you," read one note. "You were our princess," said another. The royal family, still at Balmoral, faced increasing public scrutiny. Their lack of visible response was met with mounting criticism from the press and the public. Many felt the monarchy was out of touch with the nation's grief. In an unprecedented move, the Queen eventually returned to London and addressed the nation in a rare televised speech. Standing in Buckingham Palace, she spoke as both sovereign and grandmother, acknowledging the immense sorrow the country was feeling. She paid tribute to Diana's life and legacy, recognizing her impact on the world. It was a moment that helped ease some of the tension, but the pressure on the monarchy to modernize and be more emotionally connected would linger long after the funeral. On September 6, 1997, the day of Diana's funeral, millions of people lined the streets of London. The city had never seen anything like it. The funeral procession made its way from Kensington Palace to Westminster Abbey, where the service would be held. The world watched in silence as Diana's coffin, draped in the royal standard, was carried on a gun carriage. Behind it, a heart-wrenching sight. Prince Charles, Prince Philip, Diana's brother Earl Spencer, and her two young sons, William and Harry, walked solemnly. The image of the two boys, heads bowed, following their mother's coffin, would become one of the most defining moments of the century. Inside Westminster Abbey, 2,000 guests had gathered, including world leaders, celebrities, and dignitaries. Among them were Elton John, who performed a revised version of "Candle in the Wind" in Diana's honor, and Mother Teresa, who had shared a close friendship with the princess. Earl Spencer delivered a powerful eulogy, speaking of Diana's love for her children and her ability to connect with ordinary people. He also criticized the press for their treatment of his sister, a statement that resonated deeply with the public. Many saw Diana's death as a tragic consequence of media intrusion, and Spencer's words only reinforced that sentiment. As the service came to an end, Diana's coffin was taken to Althorpe, her family's estate where she would be laid to rest. The final journey was private, attended only by close family. There, on a small island in the middle of a quiet lake, Diana was buried, a place of peace, far from the chaos that had surrounded her in life. Diana's last 24 hours were a whirlwind of emotions, chaos, and ultimately, tragedy. But her legacy endures, forever changing the way the world sees the royal family. With that, we have reached the end of today's video. If you have come this far with us, be sure to check out other videos on the channel.